Thank you, Susan. Full disclosure, I'm not in any way an expert, and my anxiety is at probably a 12. And I think it's probably because when I look around the room, my favorite people are here, the people I love the most. Thank you for coming to cheer me on. And thank you, Susan, for those wonderful words. You took the words right out of my mouth. So I'm sure I'll be referencing them. While I get organized, and folks at home, I'll put a slide on the screen. That's weird. Hello, me. I'll put a slide on the screen for you, but before I joined Brescia, I spent 2 years working as a supply teacher in the K-12 system. One of the things you learn right away is if you gotta be okay at not being the expert in the room. And so how you get through that is with something called bell work, and giving folks something to, and kids something to do as they come into the room to help get themselves settled for the day. Thank you so much, Chris, you read my mind. And ready to work and ready to think about. Now, Susan's words have helped us, but those of you in the room, you might have been given a handout as you came in and a crayon. So I want you to get those out now. Those of you at home or in your offices, you're going to need something to write on and something to write with.
Crayons are over there. So if you need crayon and you're near there, ask that person very nicely to pass it to you. And I've got some over here.
And my wonderful colleague, Chris, is literally running to give you more. Now, life will not end if you don't have a crayon. It's just for something fun.
That's crayons.
So we're getting ourselves ready to talk about decolonization. If you don't have a handout, that's okay. I only printed 100. I don't know how many we'll need.
You know, if I need them.
Oh, did you lose your crayon?
Sitting there.
Folks at home, everybody's disintegrating. All right, folks, let's put 2 feet on the floor if you are able to. Let's take 2 big, deep breaths. And if you can, in a space I've provided or on a paper that's your own, you draw what decolonization is to you. I'm not giving you a definition. I'm not telling you what to draw. You're not going to be asked to share. So I'll give you 2 minutes. What is decolonization to you? While you finish up your drawing, I'll tell you a little bit about how I found myself here. Like Susan, I'm a European settler of origin. My family came from Scotland and Ireland. My dad's family settled in Wabamek, Ontario, which is near Georgian Bay. in Parry Sound region. Wabamik is the Anishinaabe word for white beaver. And if you go there, Campbell Lake and all the houses near it are owned by my family, and we can talk about how we feel about that later. My mom's side settled in the Wellington County region, Kenilworth and Arthur, Ontario. My parents met in Wabamik and resettled here to London, where I was born, raised, went to school, never left. And neither did my spouse, Mike. We met here at Western and are now raising our son here. And while my parents didn't go to university, oopsies, oh no, it disappeared. I'll find it later. There's supposed to be a picture up here of my grandmother. My grandmother, Lillian McGee, was a graduate of the University of Toronto in 1943. And she was sent there by her very rich aunt who instilled upon my grandmother, who I never met. She died when my mom was 13. But she raised my mom and my aunts and uncles to say that women should be able to take care of their families and themselves with or without a man. And so while it was never expected of me to come to university, I always felt supported. My parents helped me get here. And I felt welcome to be here and a part of this place. Meaning I have a lot of privilege to unpack with this work. How I found myself here today is in this dream role. This particular job that I'm doing, like if you had written it, you would have thought that you had somebody like me, well, me specifically in mind. What I do, if I'm gonna be honest, what I do, like the fact that I get to be a little bit of a librarian and a little bit of a teacher and a little bit of an educational developer, it's a dream role. What I do a lot of the time is fill in the space that you see on the screen. I draw a lot of connections between folks, help them to see patterns. I hope to draw connections between faculty, student experience, the library, students, all sorts of folks. And I find myself in that third space. What it means is a lot of you don't know who I am, and it's because I'm kind of hiding in the shadows, or you know me really well, and it's because you're doing the same work. I have my little cheering squad here. One of the very first things that I was asked to do upon starting this job in late 2020 was help my teaching and learning team with the Western Libraries decolonize our library instruction program. This work is ongoing, but it's that foundational work that's what I'm here to talk about, what we learned throughout that process. And lucky for you, I wrote it down. And so the practical guide I have to share from you is the steps that we took to start and engage in that work. Before I move on, I want to have those folks wave their hands. Teaching and learning team are here. Can you wave? Whoop, whoop, whoop. Thank you. And so I won't have a lot of chance to talk about what we did, but they're here and I hope you can engage with them. It's gonna have a drink. Anxiety, I would put it now at like an 11. So we're going down. This is good. One of the things I always try to get folks to do is to feel comfortable talking about their feelings. And in academia, that's a tough gig. And so we're going to get a little practice doing that this morning. The last 3 years have been really tough on all of us. And we've learned a lot, but I think we have a lot more to go. And rather than me trying to explain and set up what I hope to talk about today, I'm going to show you a video and like wish me luck, friends, with this tech to see if I can do it. I'm going to go here to Firefox and share. And I'm going to thank you. So we're going to do this. And
I'm always sensitive
Zoom people to tell me, can you hear this? Or tell you
when we pathologize individuals instead of understanding that our society may have some troubles. The mental health crisis is a way of individualizing social problems. You're not anxious, you're living exactly appropriately given the conditions of what you're going through in your life or in your family's life. That's very different. If people are depressed, if people feel despair, if people feel anxious, you need to be able to sit with them as parents and as teachers and as therapists about the job market, about the loneliness that they are feeling in the midst of many other people, about the effects of social media on their sense of self, about climate crisis, about the war, it's like this. If you talk about these things and you tell them we all are living, this is what I mean by the holding environment, leadership in a time of crisis. It's that you actually name it rather than looking at the symptoms. You know, the symptom is just a response to something. And that something is more societal and more collective. We don't want to help our children to become more resilient. My husband wrote this book called Collective Trauma, Collective Healing. The one thing that he understood way back then, this is almost 10 years ago, was that resilience is not a bunch of traits in an individual. Resilience is the ability to tap into the collective resources. And so in light of the big issues that are happening, we are dealing with a collective resilience. And if everybody goes at it alone, then we will be overwhelmed and depressed and school avoidant and phobic and OCD and. But if we create a thing together where we understand what we are, how we maintain hope and joy and love in the direst of circumstances, then we will not have a mental health crisis. We will have a world in crisis with people that are coping.
A pattern I've observed. One of the things I said that I do a lot in this new job of mine, it's just not new at 2.5 years in, but anyway, is noticing patterns and connections. And the pattern I am seeing is that we aren't okay. And as much as we want to relate that to the pandemic, it's longer than that. It is deeper than that. And so when I hear this kind of statement to say we have a world in crisis, and we are people who are coping. All it makes me think is that the system is working the way that it was designed. The system isn't broken. It's breaking us sometimes. And the only way to fix it is together and to change the system. And it's one of the reasons why everything I come back to in my work, I hear decolonization is the only way forward, always. And it's why I've been focusing it as the center of my work the last few years. And it's because it's the only thing I can see as the step forward. But I wonder why you're here. And so I want to give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Those of you at home, grab another sheet of paper. Now, you're not going to be asked to share your responses with one another, but I am going to ask you to refer back to these questions yourself later this morning. So I'm hoping you take a couple of minutes to think about, why did you choose to come today? Do you have specific decolonization goals in mind? Specifically for your programs and departments or for yourself? And then are there barriers preventing you and your team from achieving these goals? We'll give you a couple minutes. So I won't ask you to share your answers, but I will share mine. So why did I choose to come today? Well, other than the fact that Melanie Ann made me. So one of the projects that I worked on, as I said, was supporting the teaching and learning team with decolonizing our program. And we're nowhere near done by any stretch. And that's something that I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But what we did do is write a new curriculum. And throughout that time, I was also, as Susan mentioned, working with the Center for Teaching and Learning and curriculum work. So now I'm supporting other programs with starting this work as well. And so what I did was write it down. I wrote the steps that we took, the questions we answered, the things that we read. I wrote it down into a guide. The surprise for Melanie Ann is that it's real detailed, friend. And what she thought was going to be a framework is actually a 22-page guide. Sorry about that. And so I wanted to share that with you today. Hopefully, with the idea that you can do it on your own. The second question was, what? Do I have specific decolonization goals in mind? And yes, so I've written here that I want to support Western in our decolonization work. So there's more than one way that I want you to interpret that response. So one of those is that, like I mentioned, I'm in the CTO, I'm supporting curriculum work all the time. And we're hearing more and more with ICAP changes and self-study, programs reaching out and asking us for support with, like, what do we do? How do we start? How do we talk about this in our program reviews? And so I definitely want to support that with my work. But something else that I've observed, another pattern that I'm seeing, is that Western is committing to this work, but we're relying on about 6 people to tell us how to do it. Maybe fewer. And when I said that we're not okay right now, I can't imagine how they're feeling. I probably can, but I won't speak for them, and you can ask them later. When you think about who is leading decolonization work at Western University, a campus of this size, the same few names come up. And so when I think about how can I best support, it's getting all of us doing the work. We're going to screw it up. It's going to be a mess, but we have to help them. And maybe I can help you a little bit get started. The other thing was building on the video we just watched about naming what it is. So the question that I asked you was, what are some of the barriers that might be preventing you from doing this work? And I'm going to anticipate a lot of you named time constraints, capacity, burnout. Those are real things. Yeah. I'm not trying to negate that in any way. But what I keep, again, coming back to a pattern I'm seeing is, what are the causes of that burnout? And again, the system isn't broken. It's doing exactly the way it was designed to be. And instead, we need to look at what are the colonial structures that are making us feel this way. The patriarchy, the white supremacy culture. Can we get comfortable talking about these words instead of dancing around it? So that's as much as that's a barrier, I'm hoping that we can get a little bit more comfortable this morning naming some of these things as a way to get started on this work. So for the rest of our time, what I'll do is give you a super quick overview of the guide itself. I'm not going to show it on the screen because I just think it might break my brain, but folks at home, you're going to have a link to it, and the folks here in the room, you do as well on your handout. And instead of really going through the guide in detail, what I'd rather do is do some of this hard work, name some of these more difficult things. And so we'll do one of the exercises from the guide from what's called the interrogation phase. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then before we go, this isn't my work. Nothing I'm presenting really is my work today. I've summarized frameworks and theories from decolonization experts, and then I'm building on the wisdom of my teaching and learning colleagues. And so I'm hoping that before we leave, we have a chance to hear some of their words because I've collected some reflections from them. So in your folder is the guide itself. There's the library's curriculum, which was the result of our work, which you were invited to use and adapt. And there's my slides as well. Okay. Does anyone need me to leave this up? Yes. Okay. It is also on your handout, friends. Now I'm going to have a coffee. Okay, so the thing about being an educational librarian is I know how to write a lesson plan, and I know how to find some resources and put them in a piece of paper. And so that's what the guide is. And it's building on it is like obviously building on decolonization theory, but one of the things I was doing for CTL was trying to find frameworks or practical guides, step-by-step instructions, something that would help us get started with not just decolonizing our own work and our own minds and our own classrooms, but how do you do that work as a team? How do you lead whole programs? Because that's how we work and function here. And I want to be clear for my staff friends who are visiting, while the guide is written in a way that focuses on faculty programs, you know me, a lot of you know me, that I'm hoping that this extends to your work as well. And if it doesn't, future iterations, I'm hoping you can help me make sure that they do. The three sort of frameworks that informed how my guide talks is these three on the screen. Pokalanui is a native member of Hawaii and a JD. The Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective is a group of activists and scholars. A lot of them work at UBC, and the work is largely informed by the Vanessa Andreotti and Sharon Stein, who are pictured here. And then the University of Cape Town wrote a curriculum change framework when they started their work after the Roads Must Fall protest. You can find all those links in the guide itself. What is the guide? What I've done is used their work and broken down early decolonization work into 5 phases. My huge caveat to this is it is not a checklist. It's not to say, oh, I did 5 things, I'm done. Not by any stretch, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. But instead, you want to consider each phase a threshold moment that your team needs to pass through in your learning and work towards decolonizing your program. And so through that, sometimes we get stuck. Yeah, there can be emotions that are difficult to work through. There can be concepts that we're not ready to wrestle with. And a theme or a phrase that we hear a lot in decolonization work is we need to sit with our discomfort. And so what I've tried to do is give language to that discomfort and naming its sticking points. So then for each of the phases, what you'll find in there are some suggested agendas, and they're broken down into 3 sort of chunks. The first is work that all of us individuals need to do. So it could be pre-work like watching something, reading something, reflecting on questions. The second part of each phase is a group discussion, because again, this guide is designed to navigate all of our programs and teams through decolonization. That's something we've been missing so far. And so those group discussions, again, are mostly reflection questions coming from the literature and from experts. But the third chunk then is questions for facilitators or leaders of this work. And the idea here is, this is my call to you, is we can't rely on our 6 decolonization experts to be leading this work on our campus. And instead, some of us are naturally in a position of leadership because of our roles and responsibilities. Some of us are going to be there because of our passion for decolonization and EDI. So whoever you are, there's a section for you. And those questions are designed, they're mostly reflection questions designed to help you and your program decide whether you're ready to move on to the next phase or whether you're still stuck a bit, which is fine, and need to stay for a longer time in that phase. And then because I'm a librarian, there's resources. So the resources are the readings that we work through. It's a lot of it's coming from the suggestions of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, the Office of EDI. But in particular, then this is a call out to my, again, my staff colleagues. I've tried to name in each of the phase which department at Western is really supporting that particular phase in their work, in the things that they're already doing. If I got it wrong, or if you're missing, please let me know, because I want to be really clear. No one has seen this guide except for me, because I was writing it until 4 p.m. yesterday. Okay. So if you like a graphic, I made one. And the idea is that this is how the 5 phases work together. The cycle is there to represent that we're going to go through this cycle, these 5 phases, multiple times. I shared that the teaching and learning team has engaged in it once, and the result was when we rebuilt our learning outcomes. But that's it. We haven't talked about pedagogy. We haven't looked at policy or hiring. There's other things to look at. And so in the future, we'll be going through the cycle again. And what's happened is we took a natural break, and now we're feeling, well, I can't speak for everybody, but you can decide. I think we're feeling a bit more ready to go through the cycle again, and it won't be as difficult this time. In the middle is this idea that we all have work to do to just like Susan was saying, to individually unlearn colonialism and our personal relationship with that. That is a personal journey that can take, it's your own time. And so what is accompanying this guide, and it's referenced in it, is the Office of Indigenous Initiatives is about to launch their own allyship guide. And while we haven't seen that yet, it's coming soon. And the idea is that both of these guides will work together so that we can work with the Office of Indigenous Initiatives and listen to their guidance on how to unlearn colonialism within ourselves. And hopefully my guide is useful for then guiding your programs through that work together as a team. We're going to talk very briefly about this, and then I'm going to get you to do some work. The first phase is grounding. And the idea is that you're actually gathering together as a group, as your team, to review your local context and then actually commit to decolonization work. I know you can do this because you're here and you're already doing it. The questions that are in the guide are things you've already answered this morning. What is decolonization to you? Can you define it now as a group? Can you work through that? What are your priorities? What are your goals? Are there barriers for that? One of the sticking points could be that you don't have a history of talking about difficult concepts as a team. That's something you're going to want to address right away at the beginning. And I know, and so one of the things that can come up is, how do we define decolonization? This isn't guesswork, and we don't want to each come up with our own definition. Instead, what I have in the guide is the definition that's given to us from the Office of Indigenous Initiatives. They've taken it from the Igniting Change final report. I'm going to read it to you, and you can reflect while I do on how your picture is reflected in this definition. So they say that the decolonization is a necessary and ongoing process of unlearning, uncovering, and transforming the legacies of colonialism, as well as utilizing the educational and knowledge systems available to relearn and rebuild the social, cultural, and linguistic foundations that were lost or eroded through colonialism. It's the second part that I'll put on the screen now that really called to me, which is decolonization requires making space, balancing, generating, and enabling diverse knowledge systems to thrive in the academy. And I'll leave the rest of it for you to read. This, to me, when I look at making space and enabling diverse knowledges, we're not doing that. And if I was to go back to the image of that I had before of space in between hands, that to me is what decolonization is letting go of what we're doing, not because it's bad, but because we're not leaving room and still owning who we are and what we're good at, but at least starting to make space. The second phase is interrogation. And this is where we start to really look at the truth. It's an open-minded exploration of your field's origins or your discipline and its impact on equity-deserving groups. I liked what I wrote in my notes, so I'm just going to find them. Interrogation is where we honestly answer difficult questions about ourselves, about the university, and about our disciplines. We want to interrogate what is our discipline. We want to interrogate what is happening in our discipline, and we want to interrogate what's happening because of our discipline. Some of the questions we answered through this phase were, who created our discipline and why? Where were they from? Whose interests are they serving and whose voices are missing because of them? And as a result of those decisions that were made by real humans, how are Black, Indigenous people of color, similarly marginalized and equity deserving groups, how are they experiencing our field as our colleagues? What impact are we having outside? This is the work I'm going to get you to try now. Okay. And because none of you are sitting necessarily with your disciplinary colleagues, and lots of you are online, thank you, friends. We're going to be thinking about our work as university employees when we do this activity. So we're going to watch 2 videos on white supremacy culture. This is coming out of the work of Tema Okun, a scholar who has defined 15 elements of white supremacy culture. We're just going to watch 2, maybe 1. We'll see how much time we have. And while you watch, I want to encourage you to think back to your opening reflection about what goals you have and what barriers you feel may be preventing you from achieving them. And think about how they may connect with these two elements of white supremacy culture. Can I do it? Do you have faith in me? Oh, I don't. Because you know what might be, I put it in the slide. Do we have faith in me? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Judy Blair, and I'm an anti-racism consultant specializing in working with white folks. I'm also a member of the team at Diverse City, and I'm really excited to be bringing you this video series. In this series, we're taking a look at 15 different aspects of white supremacy culture. Now, when I use the term white supremacy in this context, I am not talking about white supremacists. I'm not talking about Proud Boys or white nationalists. I am talking about white supremacy as the idea that whiteness is the ideal. It is the default. It is what is assumed in our culture. The 15 aspects that we're discussing in this video series come from a list published in 1999 by Tema Okun, an anti-racist trainer and activist. The list itself is a culmination of work by multiple people, including Tema, but also including Kenneth Jones, Daniel Buford, James Williams, Sharon Martinez, and others. Over the past 2 decades, the list has served as a useful framework for recognizing, disrupting, and dismantling white supremacy in our day-to-day lives. I want to be really clear here. The values and norms this video series is addressing are not exclusive to Western white culture, and they are not inherently bad or good. They are merely often invisible ways of being that are part of our socialization. If we want to create a more just and equitable world, we have to interrogate these values when we notice them coming up, checking to see if an alternate way of being might provide better, more equitable results. A word of caution. These norms should not be taken as a checklist of behaviors to eliminate, with the alternatives enshrined as the cure for all that ails us. Critical analysis and weighing of these norms when they crop up is vital. There is no shortcut to uprooting white supremacy. Each video in this series focuses on one aspect from the list, and today's aspect is worship of the written word. So it's helpful to write stuff down. Absolutely. It's helpful to have an agenda for a meeting. Yep. But sometimes what worship of the written word can bring us is the idea that if it's not written down, it's not important. Or if it's not in a memo, it didn't happen. If it's not in the history book, it's not real. And we end up missing out on so many voices when we only focus on the written word. Worship of the written word in a meeting that has an agenda can mean that someone who needs to bring something up can't, because we're hemmed in by the agenda. Worship of the written word when we're looking at history means that we are devaluing oral histories. When we're gathering data, we're devaluing anecdotal data. There's so many ways in which we can gather information, be enlightened, discuss things that aren't written down. And so I challenge you to see if you can spot worship of the written word when it's coming up. And when it does, because it will, take a moment and ask, is this how we want to do this right now? Is there a different way that might be better? Because sometimes there is. Sometimes there isn't, but you have to ask the question.
That was tough for me, yeah, because I just wrote a 22-page guide. And you laugh, but all I'm doing is repackaging decolonial expert knowledge into a form that's more palatable to academic audiences. So this one's tough for me a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. The librarians talked about this one a lot. So one more, and then I'll get you to do some work.
Is sense of urgency. Oh, how many of you have come across a deadline that feels like it was just set because someone needed a deadline? It happens. Some things are actually urgent. If I were injured and needed assistance, that would be urgent. However, many of the things that we encounter in our daily lives are not, in fact, urgent. And when we imbue things with a sense of urgency, it pressures us to make decisions very quickly. And when we make decisions very quickly, we don't always hear everyone who's involved in being impacted by those decisions. If we're able to slow down for a moment and say, hey, wait, do we need to make this decision by end of day Friday? Or can we actually wait a couple of weeks and make sure that we've gathered all the information that we need? Then you may end up with a more equitable decision. I challenge you to look for a sense of urgency. I often call it a false sense of urgency. And just take a second when you see it and ask, is this really urgent? Is this deadline real? Do we need to slow down? Will we be better off if we slow down? And then I challenge you to ask folks to slow down. Thanks.
I'm not your boss, so you can sort that one out on your own. Alrighty. So we're going to do a little bit of an activity now where we talk about how just those two elements, there's 13 more, are impacting you or might be impacting you. The other thing I want you to reflect on is how might those elements of white supremacy culture impact your team's decolonization work. I imagine you'll center on urgency there. I want to give 8 minutes to this activity, please, because we're a bit short on time. And so those of you in the room, you're invited to reflect on your own, work with a group, colleague next to you. Those of you online, we're going to give you the option of joining a breakout room, and we're not going to force you into it. I'm going to just check with Stephanie how we're doing. Like 3, 4. Those in the, go ahead, folks in the room, folks on Zoom, we'll get you going in a minute.
Into Western here. Chickens front. Here.
Breakout rooms are always the death knell. Little do they know, they're going to miss the best part. Thank you so much. I'm not going to ask you to reflect back to the large group. One of the things I wanted to practice with our decolonization work is what happens in the room stays in the room. What happened in your conversation stays in your conversation. This is about learning together. And instead, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what we learned. And this is folks who have volunteered to share what they've learned as we've gone through this cycle. And sorry. So a reminder that there's 5 stages. Before we move on from interrogation, I wanted to share a video from my colleague, Christy. Let me just look at my notes again to see what I wanted to say. Christy's going to reflect on how our decolonization work has impacted her understanding of herself and her teaching. And so before we move on from the discussion you were just having, while you watch, I encourage you to think about how decolonization work and the things I've been talking about this morning challenge academic culture. And she'll be talking about that too. Let's see.
Heather often described our decolonizing work as heavy heart work. It was. For me, what it boiled down to was checking my ego at the door. Decolonizing our thinking requires transformation, and you have to lay your heart out for any transformation to occur. I feel like I still have a lot of unlearning to do. It's early days for me, and so I'm making small changes. For me, it's tuning in, being more sensitive to the language that I use. For example, I tend to ad-lib a lot when I'm teaching. And I was teaching a workshop to students about researching potential companies that they might one day
Oh no.
work for. And I was about to say, you might even get headhunted. But just before saying that, my brain paused. And I edited what I was going to say, and I said, a company might seek you out. And honestly, I don't know what the etymology of the expression headhunting is, but it doesn't sound good. So I just went with my instinct there. And I think that's from all the work that we've done. I think the old me wouldn't have done that self-editing. I would have just blurted it. Yeah, so I think I'm probably offending people a lot less than I used to. So for me, being self-aware of my language has been a huge shift.
How proud are we of her? Hard to say. Something I'm supposed to be doing every time is hiding these floating controls, and I haven't been doing it. Okay. The third phase of the, what's the word I want? Cycle. There we go. Is new learning. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because the idea here is that in interrogation, we've interrogated our disciplines, our work. And at doing so, we come to understand that we have things to learn. And there's different ways of doing that. There's different ways of being. And so in the third phase, we explore those, not necessarily from the place of our discipline, but with an open heart and an open mind. And so by the end of that, you can imagine, obviously, we spent a ton of time in this phase, and we weren't done yet. I'll share a slide in a minute that explains what I mean. Having gone through a lot of the programming from the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, we tried to answer the question of how do Indigenous epistemologies encourage us to rethink our discipline, and where are we continuing to uphold a Eurocentric approach, and where do we want to change? This is the Office of Indigenous Initiatives services support programming that we've engaged in on our team so far. This is since 2021 when they were created. Not all of us have done everything, of course, but this is to say that this is where we've had presence, and we don't in any way obviously feel like we're done. And so when I was speaking earlier about supporting our colleagues who are already leading this work, this is what they're doing. They're supporting an entire phase of decolonization work, and I don't want to ask them to do more. I don't want to ask them to create customized stuff for me, because they're already creating things from their own worldview. And so instead, the new learning phase is my encouragement to engage in a good way in the programming we already have available. And so the guide directs you to a lot of that. The fourth phase is commitment. And the idea is we've interrogated who we are in our disciplines, we've engaged in new learning, but commitment is why I talk about phases at all in the guide. And it comes from both Kokolanui's work, as well as the curriculum change framework, as well as Sharon Stein's work. And it's this idea of we are academics. We can talk all the livelong day about the value of different perspectives. We can critique things. We can engage in thought experiments, but a commitment in public with our team to a different way of doing things is a threshold moment. And there isn't a lot of like questions, oopsies, that the guide suggests you to work through. I don't have a lot of stuff to give you here. Instead, the questions are like, what traditions, ideas, and values do you want to withdraw or reprioritize or change? What's missing and can be added to your program? It's not a lot of questions here, but this takes a long time. And we revisited these questions a couple of times until we felt ready. And a lot of that, right, and you'll see it in the guide talk, is really working through our own stuff. We've invested a ton of time in becoming experts in our field. And it can feel like decolonization is asking you to give that away or to set it aside. And it's not. It's about making room. And so it can take some time to commit, but let's see what the impacts are when we do. Oops. So we're going to hear from my colleague Dan now, in theory. Oh no, everybody. Oh, look, Siri's asking me how I'm doing. Okay. And Dan's gonna reflect on how these stages, thank you for seeing. Up, oh my God,
Just below where you are. There you go.
yay. I love you.
There's a ton of knowledge available on this topic already. The important thing is for us to find it and to engage with it. And there's no single correct way of doing this work. The important thing to do is to just start the work and to bear in mind that the end result is never going to be perfect and the work is never going to be finished. In the past, I've taught learners to hold peer-reviewed academic sources above all others. And how that's changed is I'm now framing the library as one place among many that learners can search for valuable knowledge to help out with their research. By listening to marginalized voices and engaging with knowledge from marginalized communities, we can develop our ability to teach effectively to a broader audience of learners.
No. Watch, I'll get it at the very end. Ready? Yeah. Okay. The last phase before I leave you is rebuilding. And as you can imagine, the first time you go through the cycle, a lot comes up. You talk about policy, you talk about hiring practices, you talk about how the university is funded, and you didn't really know any about that before. And you talk about your discipline and curriculum and pedagogy, etc. That's a lot. So in the rebuilding phase is when you actually act on the commitments you made in the previous phase. And what I encourage you to do is choose one thing. For us, I've already mentioned, a teaching and learning team, we rewrote our learning outcomes. And so it feels funny to say that 2 years of work, because the cycle took us 2 years, resulted in 6 sentences on a piece of paper. And so one of the things I encourage you to reconsider when engaging in decolonization work, and I said this only in the abstract, I haven't said it today, is negotiating a relationship with productivity. And what we mean here is you've heard now from 2 of my colleagues about how impactful this process was on who they are as people. How do I measure that? How do I put that into a quantitative form or count it on a document? I can't. And when I share one piece of paper with learning outcomes on it, as the results of all of this work, it doesn't totally jive. But instead, what it was is an opportunity for us to really put in words what we stand for. A thing I'll mention in the guide is I really encourage you to do this rebuilding work in partnership with students. We have this propensity, this history of doing a lot of this work in theoretical form on our own. I think it was probably the most impactful part of this process was working directly with students, and they changed a ton of what the outcomes were. These learning outcomes are for you. We've put a Creative Commons license on them. They are centered on knowledge justice, and they talk about research from a decolonized viewpoint. Programs are invited to use them, adapt them into disciplinary language or not, but in particular to partner with the teaching and learning team to work at how they might support your courses and program learning outcomes as you too decolonize. The last thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is, and obviously I have one more piece of homework for you, is thinking about our role in this work. And historically, what we've talked about at Spring Perspectives, Fall Perspectives is decolonizing ourselves in our work. And one of the barriers that I hear a lot in the nature of my work is it's all too much. And it's true, we're asking you to do a lot, especially classroom faculty, that there's a lot to learn. But with a decolonized viewpoint, what I'm hoping that I've made it clear is it's not about each one of us decolonizing the institution on our own. It's about doing this work together and finding our corner. My corner was this for now. I'm gifting it to you, and I know we'll talk about how to use the guide in a minute. But that's mine for now, and then we'll see, right? I need to find a new corner now that this is done. So before we finish up, I want to share a video from Kim, who's my boss. She's the head of our team, and she reflects on like thinking about how we each have a role to play in this work, particularly managers and leaders. This time I put a link, everyone, but I got to fix it for Zoom. Oh no. Nice. Okay. I also put a link in my OneDrive. Are you proud of me?
I have learned that decolonization is truly a community effort. We need buy-in and support at every level of the organization, from formal commitments written in strategic planning documents to the personal commitment of each individual. Decolonization is hard and uncomfortable work, and the first step is to move into a place of vulnerability and humility, and simply open our hearts to learning. This learning, this work, looks different than our regular work. And an example from the teaching and learning team at Western Libraries is that we shifted the time we would have normally spent on, say, team building, retreats, and pedagogy dialogue, these sorts of things, to instead focus on journal club style conversations and retreats focused on learning and indigenization, and then spending substantial amount of time writing our new decolonized library curriculum. And this required buy-in from senior leaders at Western Libraries. It's absolutely essential to have leaders at all levels of the organization on board to support this work and support the time that it takes to unlearn what we've been taught all of our lives and to open ourselves to learning hard truths. Decolonization is a commitment that Western has made and that we each need to make if we are to truly decenter whiteness and center equity-deserving groups, and then in turn build the welcoming community that Western aspires to be.
Thank you, Kim. Take 30 seconds and think about what work is necessary to move your team to the next phase or the first phase of decolonization, and what will you personally contribute? So before I open it up for precisely 10 minutes of questions, the guide itself, literally, no one has read it. And so I know we have folks on Zoom joining us from non-Western institutions. I'm hoping you can email me to talk about how you'd like to use the guide. What I would like to have happen is that I share the guide with our campus decolonization experts for their input and whether the guide is actually fitting into their needs or if they would suggest changes. Those of you who are Western colleagues, feel free to use it in the meantime. If you want to gather your teams together to start the work, grounding is getting together and talking about values. I'm hoping that I didn't screw that one up. And we'll share a purple version when we're feeling like it's ready for purple flying. I want to say thank you so much for coming.